Are robot lawnmowers a gimmick, or are they actually a really useful addition to your robotic servant staff? Well, hopefully I'll be able to answer that question today by taking a look at the Mammotion Yuka. The thing is, this was a bit of an odd one for me to review because I actually like mowing the garden. So for me, it was about exploring whether or not having a robot to do it would add benefit to me or take away from something that I enjoyed doing. Along with, of course, testing whether or not this type of device can actually perform as good a job or better than I can with a mower. And I want to start by talking about the assembly and setup experience, which for the most part, from a hardware perspective, was straightforward as the robot came pretty much pre-assembled. It even came with the blades attached to the bottom. Lift it out of the box and it's ready to go as it is, so I can't really fault that. You just need to plug in the base station, stick the Gandalf Staff RTK GPS positioning tool into the ground next to the charging station, plug it in, and you're done. There is some flexibility with the placement of the staff, and you're done. You can essentially start the mapping process and off you go. However, there is a bit of a further setup needed if you want to use the feature and secret weapon that the Yuka has, which I think makes this device an absolute powerhouse of a robot. Now, on its own, as it is, straight out the box, it will only mulch the garden, which essentially means that it will leave the cut grass where it's cut. This is good for the garden on occasion, and it can return a good percentage of nutrients to the ground. But it does make a mess, especially if you have dogs and kids running around outside. They end up trailing the grass throughout the house, which is annoying. And also, mulching is only really suitable for the middle of the year. You can't really do it at the start or end of the mowing year because of all the debris that's built up over the winter and all the kind of long grass. Which is why Mammotion have come up with an amazing solution in the form of a self-emptying collection basket. Now, oddly, this came in quite a few more parts than I expected, and was a little bit of a faff to set up compared to the robot, which was pretty much just plug and play. But once the parts are assembled, all you do is drop it onto the back of the mower, click in the connecting cord, and you're done. I actually really like the design of this because it is really as simple as plugging in the cord or unclipping it, putting it in the basket's holder, and then pressing the button to release it and remove the entire basket if you wanted to. It just feels like a really well-designed experience to allow a modular change whenever you want the basket or not. But I'll come back to the basket shortly because it does more than just collect grass. But once you've got it all assembled, you then need to go through the software setup, which is also pretty simplistic. Ish. Once you've connected via the Bluetooth to your phone, you're supposed to then drive it around the perimeter of your garden to set its boundaries. Now, this is fine and all, but the amount of times that my phone's Bluetooth would drop in and out, causing me to be unable to move the robot for a few seconds until the Bluetooth connection re-established, well, that happened more times than I'd like. I wish there was some kind of cheap RC controller in the box to drive it around instead of having to use the phone's Bluetooth. That would probably make for an even quicker experience, but as it is, it's still super simple and very quick to set up. And once it's done, you should never have to do it again. Fingers crossed. Touch wood. Actually, I had to do mine twice because I had to move the Gandalf's RTK GPS positioning staff. And if you do that, you'll need to then remap the entire garden. But the second time I manually mapped, the connection seemed to be a little bit more stable, so I'm not sure what was going on there. Perhaps it was a skill issue the first time. Or perhaps there had been an update that made it more stable. But once this is done, and you've set a designated dumping spot for the grass in the app, it's a case of letting it go on its way for the first run of the garden. And boy, are there a ton of settings you can change about the way this cuts the grass. In fact, there are some settings I'd never even considered when it came to grass cutting. So as a novice grass cutter, there were some things that I didn't even dare to touch. And to be honest, I think I just need an entire episode looking at the different styles of cutting this can achieve, because that will take me 20 minutes on its own. So I think I'll stick really to the core functionality and review the sort of performance based on its default settings. But in respect to its customizability, you're able to change all sorts of stuff, such as the pan it mows, the width of the lines it mows, how many times around the perimeter it goes, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. The main thing, though, you'll probably play around with straight away out of the box is the cutting height, which is done by the large knob on the top of the robot rather than through the app. And this changes the height of its internal cutting blades and where they sit. Now what's cool is that these blades do adapt slightly to the undulations of the ground so that you end up with a much neater, straighter cut than traditional mowers that have fixed blades. But overall, I've been super impressed with how it's performed over this summer. You can see from this 3-week time lapse that the garden stays super neat the entire time, even during really wet periods. I'd go as far as saying it's the neatest my garden has ever looked over any summer there's ever been. The only place I found that it struggles in terms of cutting is the very, very edges of the garden where the grass comes up to a wall or a planter. Now it won't do this very thin section because the robot's cutting blades are a few inches from the edge of the robot, obviously for safety measures so it doesn't end up chopping off your toes. So I'll give them a pass on that one. You'll either need to get comfortable with it being a little bit longer at these points or get your strimmer out once every couple of weeks, which I tended to do. Now, along with things like cutting patterns, intervals, schedules and speed, you can also set specific areas in the app such as different zones with different schedules, no-go areas and even set patterns so that you can shave designs into your garden. So I thought I'd do a little heart to say thank you in advance for hitting that thumbs up. But it did a really good job of maintaining this shape and translating it from the app. One quick comment here is that the resolution of the shapes are quite large. Don't expect to do anything with fine detail. It seems like even the smallest setting for a shape is quite big. With this in mind, if you intend on adding shapes to your garden, I'd say you'd probably need a medium or perhaps even large area for it to make a big impact. You can see here from the size of the heart that it covers a significant portion of space in my garden, and that's the smallest that I could make it. So all I'm saying is don't expect it to be able to mow a portrait of yourself into the garden. It's not that high a resolution, unfortunately. But for all purposes, if you're using this over large areas, you could create some quite stunning displays. Now, let's move back to the back, because this basket has been my favourite part of the entire experience because it's not just a basket. Firstly, it has a silicone sweeper built into it, not too dissimilar to a robot vacuum you'd find around the house. This allows it to sweep up all the cuttings into the basket as it goes along, but it also allows you to sweep up any other debris into it too, such as leaves and twigs and broken bits of clothes pegs that my wife seems to leave everywhere, and anything else that shouldn't be on the lawn. I think this in itself has been the sole reason my lawn has never looked better, because it's always neat, always tidy, and it manages to remove all of the dead rubbish from the grass that isn't helping it thrive. Now, once the mower has traversed a certain amount of space, it will then take all of those cuttings and debris over to a designated dumping spot that you set at the very start when you map the garden. Now it wanders over, it backs itself up to it, lifts up the basket and drives off, leaving all the cuttings in a neat pile. It'll keep doing this every time it hits a certain amount of coverage, and then lastly, it'll do it at the very end of the session. Now, depending on the grass length, you can change how often it does this. So you could say, for example, set it to do it every 10 square meters it covers, or you leave it at the default, which I think is 15 square meters. I think this is such a cool feature because it makes the garden neat and the whole mowing experience more automated. But there are some caveats with the dumping spot functionality that I've found limits you somewhat. And that's that you can't have a dumping spot on the perimeter. You have to have it around a meter and a half away from the nearest perimeter, which, depending on your lawn, could be a bit tricky. It means for me that instead of being able to dump it here, slightly down the slope and out of sight, I have to dump it in the middle of the trees and either leave it there or manually shovel it to the very back of my garden once every while. I'm hoping that eventually they update the software to allow a dumping at the perimeter, because for me that makes a lot more sense. It's out of the way, out of sight, out of mind. I guess this is specific to my garden, and you may have a better spot for it in yours. But for me, it's just a bit of an awkward spot. It's one of the biggest considerations that if you do want to use the basket and you have a smaller garden space, then the dumping spot may end up being further out into the garden than it would be if you manually emptied it. With that said, you don't actually have to dump it at all. If it's just keeping on top of the grass every single day, it might not even fill up the basket after a run, so you could manually empty it after the run by lifting it off its back and dumping it yourself. Now, I have a sneaky suspicion that the automated dumping spot situation is this way because of the way the sensors work. The robot has most of its sensors on the front of the body and one on the top angled back, but there's this vision module on the very, very front that essentially helps it find its way about. On a side note, this little module is cool because you can actually drive it around and view its camera remotely on the phone, even when not at home. And it even has a little wiper on the front if the module needs cleaning, which you can remotely control, which is both cute and practical. But moving back to the point, because it only has this one module pointing slightly upright and looking back, it's got limited vision for its rear end, and I found that occasionally when trying to manoeuvre through my orchard area or right up against boundaries or corners, it can sometimes get its rear end stuck for a little while because it can't sense there's an object or barrier there. What are you doing? Now, there's not much solution to this other than trying not to use it in areas that are intricate and fiddly with lots of obstacles. I mean, they might be able to release an updated basket with sensors on the rear and sides, potentially. It's not that this one isn't good. For the most part, it handles everything well, and when you've dialed in the mapping, it rarely gets stuck. I've just found that it still occasionally needs my help when it seems to forget the basket is attached. Of course, this is only a problem if using the basket. When not, and only the front section to mulch, I've yet to see it get stuck, and it navigates extremely efficiently. Now, talking about the navigation and obstacle avoidance, one of my concerns when looking at robot mowers was safety. I didn't want to come out and find that my dog is missing a foot, or that my daughter is suddenly half the height that she was when I let her out to play. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't advise letting children or dogs play around it whilst it's running, but with that said, the safety systems that Mammotion have built into this thing are exactly what was needed. It uses a form of 3D vision to detect and move around objects placed in front of it, along with its physical bumper and additionally a lift tilt sensor so that it senses if it's been tilted drastically or lifted. The blades will then immediately stop for safety so no one can get their hands under. And as I already mentioned, the blades are a good distance again from the side of the robot, minimising any accidental toe trims. But once it's finished its run, it will navigate itself back to the base station and skewer itself onto the 2 charging rods to recharge its batteries. And that is the robot's day done. Overall, a fantastic experience, which means that I can run my mower around my garden on almost a daily basis to stay on top of it all from the shelter of my armchair. But perhaps the real sticking point for people inviting this technology into the home, or garden for that matter, is the cost. Now, at first, I must admit, I was a bit about the price. At nearly £1,500 RRP, I thought that was quite expensive. But after further consideration, I don't actually think it's that bad at all. In fact, I'd probably say it's relatively good value, and I've come to that conclusion for 2 reasons. Firstly, in comparison to robot vacuum cleaners, it's only a little bit more expensive than some of the more high-end models that I've tested, such as the Eufy S1 Pro, which was incredible. And this, comparably, is the same sort of all-in-one device. It mows your lawn and sweeps it up. And in this instance, I believe it's the first ever robot with this sweeping and auto-depositing system. So there's nothing even remotely similar to compare it to. But if we were to compare it to non-robotic lawnmowers, it's not too far off mid to high-end models in respect to pricing. And with those, you obviously have to do it yourself, which is where the second consideration comes in, the time and labour saving element. Now, I have a relative who's a gardener, and he charges a very conservative around £20 per hour. And let's say that you have a medium-sized garden that might take 2 to 3 hours to complete. We'll go with £50 a pop, then we might need them 8 months of a year from March to October to cut your grass, and then let's be really conservative and say you only need it doing once every fortnight, although in the growing months this will be more like once a week at very least. In total, you'll spend a bare minimum of probably around £800 on the pleasure of having a gardener come to treat your lawn. Now, if you wanted to do it yourself and you value your time at a similar target, add to that the cost of a very average lawnmower at around £400, you're looking at around £1,200 for the first year for your machine and your labour, and then after that, raising by £800 a year for your labour forever after. With the Yuka, it might be £1,500, but that's it. You're essentially done. From year 2, it's saving you nearly £800 a year in money if you need to hire someone to do the lawn, or perhaps nearly 3 hours a week in your own time mowing the lawn. If you're someone who is stuck for time, or someone who is not physically able to get out and mow the lawn, this kind of solution is ideal.
Now, there's one last thing when it comes to costs that I want to discuss, and that's the ongoing maintenance. And the truth is, I don't know how much this will cost to keep running. One thing I can say is that I've had it running for several months and nothing has gone wrong. I've not needed to replace anything, so it's cost me absolutely nothing. There are, however, a couple of consumables that you might want to think about. But on here, we've got on the underside a couple of little bits that you might want replacing. You've got the discs, which might need replacing if they get damaged. You can replace those, they have those for sale. You might want to replace the blades, although these are supposed to last 100 hours of use. And you can buy multiple sets on their website as well. You can also flip them over because they're reversible. But lastly, there's also the battery. And one thing that I love about this is that the batteries are replaceable and modular, and you can fit 2 of them in the bottom just here. So that is super useful with this device. It means that over time, if the batteries in several years' time decide to wear out, you can replace those with ease. And it's not too expensive to do so either. I believe on their website at the moment, they're $199 for a battery, which, okay, isn't cheap. But if you're only buying one of those every 5 years, that's not that bad. But all in all, it's a very modular device with lots of replacement parts that you can buy directly from Mammotion.
For me, it just fits into a busy life, making sure that my garden is always pristine and my kids have a nice place to play outside. And that's priceless. Because it's literally a robotic servant, it doesn't need a day off and I can run it as many times as I want. So if I wanted the most well-maintained garden, this thing could run twice a day, every single day, and my garden will always be perfect. And I have to say that this summer, I've already said it, my garden has never looked better. Not because it's been trimmed down almost every day, but I think because that sweeper has actually really helped make the grass more healthy by picking up all that dead rubbish and stuff that had been littering the garden for years that just doesn't get picked up by a regular lawnmower. It's basically like having a hoover for your garden. And it's been worth it just for that. And I think there's even more benefits to consider. I can actually use this robot much longer than I would typically use a normal mower for, because as we get into the autumn, I can use it to do things like picking up all the dead leaves that are falling off the trees, negating the need as well for a leaf blower, another piece of equipment that has saved me money and time on. So, in a nutshell, sure, I absolutely love gardening and mowing my lawn, but it really is hard to argue the massive amount of benefits that the Mammotion Yuka can bring to my daily life, even at that cost. It performs well, it's pretty maintenance free, makes my garden look better than ever because it gets mowed and cleared more often, and let's face it, it's one more robot closer to my dream of a full household of robot servants. What do you think of the Mammotion Yuka? Is this a device that you can see fitting into your lives, or is it a cost too far for robot technology? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want to check out the Mammotion Yuka for yourself, I'll drop a link in the description below. But other than that, guys, thank you very much for joining. And if I've helped you decide if this device is for you or not, make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe. And I'll see you back for another episode of STU'S Reviews soon.